Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Rosenberg, and I'm excited to share on a method that you might know about already, you might have explored, uh, and I think has a lot of room to grow in STEM education research. So hopefully, if you're already familiar, you'll learn something new. And if this is new to you, hopefully this will be an accessible introduction to social network analysis, a broad umbrella for um, research methods that allow us to study relationships. So we'll do two things in this last 35 minutes or so. First, be introduced and discuss and interact a little bit around five ideas, five ideas related to network analysis. I held off on saying core. I'll say why in a moment. And then we'll do a walkthrough of a network analysis learning lab or a demo. And this is you, again, having the chance to run code using RStudio Cloud to see in our code how you can do some of the things that we talk about in this first part, the brief overview of network analysis. So here we are with the short presentation. There's five parts to it. We address these questions and then as in summary, discuss five ideas that we can sort of crystallize or pull out from these, from answering these questions that help to answer the question, what is network analysis and how can we use it in our research? So first, why use network analysis? Networks matter. For instance, I chose to interact with certain colleagues in my department of Theory and Practice in Teacher Education. And those interactions expanded my network so that later on I could text friends and say, hey, that was a great meeting we had, or that was a really weird presentation that we all went to. So my network expanded through choosing to interact with certain departmental colleagues. A friend shared with me about Ted Lasso, and that caused me and my wife to watch the show over the next couple of weeks. For students, peers impact students quite a bit, directly and indirectly. And we can also see not so young people being affected by networks in the context of participating in discussion forums in online or face-to-face courses, where some students might reply to others through discussion forums, and certain ideas might get taken up by the class and discussed further, and others might get dropped, maybe because a discussion post wasn't really replied to by many. Furthermore, educators are influenced by networks too. More experienced colleagues shape what teachers see as effective teaching practices. And we're also seeing nowadays ideas about teaching and resources diffusing through social media. There's pretty vibrant teacher communities on platforms such as Pinterest and Twitter, as well as Facebook and other platforms. So networks matter. So really quick, this is just a reflection, not a poll. Just ask yourself, what are some aspects of networks that might matter to your own life, as well as your research and teaching? So just kind of put on the network hat and sort of see these things, your life and research and teaching, through the lens of networks. Where might networks matter? And where might they not matter? Okay, we'll proceed. In our research, though, despite networks possibly having a place in our lives and in our work, we often focus on individuals. And this is probably for good reason. Individual characteristics matter a lot, whether we're talking about teachers or students. But research has showed that there's often a lot of unexplained variation in things that we care about, like student achievement or teacher professional learning, even when we account for just individual level characteristics. And so one solution to this problem has been to embrace multi-level analyses. This is more of a quantitative approach, but we'll talk about how a similar sort of impulse is shared by qualitative researchers. And so in multi-level analyses, we examine the dependencies at multiple levels. And so this is an example from a study that looks at a number of teacher characteristics as individuals and how those shifted throughout the course. This is a great study by Matt Kaler and Punya Mishra around the TPACK framework that some of you might be familiar with. But relationships matter too. And so a place to look for greater shared variation in outcomes that we care about is the interdependencies among educators, students, and others, like administrators or counselors in schools or librarians. So relationships are a potential source of variation. And there's an extensive tradition in qualitative research of looking at how interactions at multiple levels impact the people that we care about, whether we're talking about educators or students. And so ethnographic research particularly is really strong with respect to honoring these values of looking at how interactions among people, such as students in their peer groups, might shape their identity or their learning. And similarly, work has also taken on the question of how teachers in places like teacher break rooms share ideas about teaching that shape their own practice when they take up those ideas. So a big idea, the first of five, is that though we often focus on individuals, network analysis allows us to focus on relationships between individuals. So the first poll question of two, there's another one during the lab part, the demo part, is which of the following has to do with a social relationship? So this is just sort of just a chance to kind of check in on this. Thank you, Ajit. 4 different options here. Teacher self-efficacy, how many peers a teacher asks for help, a measure of teachers' instructional practice, or teachers' years of experience. So which of these has to do in some way with a social relationship? Keep this open for another 10 or 15 seconds or so. All right. Can we see the results to the first question? All right, so some variation across these, but many of you indicating that how many peers a teacher asks or reaches out to or turns to for help is something that has to do more with the relationship. And maybe those of you who answered others or indicated other responses here were thinking about ways that these could be social. And I think you'd probably be right. Perhaps how many peers a teacher asks for help is kind of fundamental, more about a social relationship, even more than the others, but this is open to debate. So what is social network analysis? We can think of network analysis as a collection of techniques for examining relationships that can take many forms. And I just want to highlight here that these can be face-to-face relationships or online relationships. The data we use for social network analysis too can take a lot of different forms. So that's one thing I want you to be thinking about right now is if you're interested in network analysis, don't think about just one kind of social network or one kind of relationship. Think broadly. So self-reported relationships like those that are used in studies by Cynthia Coburn and colleagues, where they ask educators, who do you consider to be an expert in your school? Who do you turn to when you have a question about your teaching or about your classroom? These are relationships that teachers report. They say, I go to Mrs. Black for help about my science teaching. Or I go to these 5 colleagues, and I go to colleague 1 a lot, and I go to colleague 5 a little bit, but I can still consider them to be a source of help. Another kind of data is data that has to do with relationships inferred from digital sources of data. So for example, we can construct social networks from discussion forums, examining who replies to whom, through threads on social media platforms, like on Twitter, when one individual replies to another, or one individual retweets another, and through other traces. We can think about these really broadly. Even emails might constitute a form of a social relationship. If you email somebody a lot versus not emailing someone at all, that could indicate something that you could infer to be a relationship. So idea number 2 is that the kinds of relationships we investigate depend on our research questions, and that we can be guided by prior research and theory to figure out what kind of relationship matters for the studies that we are interested in. There's not one method for network analysis. The technique we use can take a lot of different forms. So you might be familiar with network analysis because of the network visualizations, also known as sociograms, that analysts can create. And these are great and often really helpful and informative. In fact, if you can visualize a network, you might instantly gain insight into who's a key actor, who is maybe not as connected as you'd like to be in that network. But visualizing is just the beginning. And you can also describe networks in the same way that we can describe quantitative data. We can describe networks through network summary statistics. We can also use network models for key social processes, such as who is selecting to interact with whom, and how do our networks influence some our beliefs or some outcomes that we achieve, or something that we consider to be some positive accomplishment that teachers or students can achieve. So these methods go by a number of names too: social network analysis, or SNA, network analysis, and network science. And if you're kind of seeing a lot of different names for something similar, that's probably the case, and that different fields use slightly different variations of these terms. So idea number 3 is that social network analysis is not a thing. It's not just one thing. It's a collection of methods for visualizing, describing, and modeling network data. And which techniques you choose depends on the kinds of claims that you want to make. So just another of these kind of reflection questions. If you were in a class right now, I'd ask for you to turn to an elbow partner and consider what are some ways you could gather data on relationships, perhaps a relationship that matters in your field. Okay, we'll go on. So next, we'll discuss some common techniques for social network analysis. So if we're dealing with self-reported relationships, then the nominator typically refers to the person we ask ask the question, who do you turn to for advice, for instance? Whereas the nominees refer to those that the nominator said, I go to these people for help. So one person can nominate between 0 and often, in the case of self-reported network data, up to around 10 others who they have a relationship with. And the question that we ask also depends on our research area. So we might ask, who do you turn to for help? Or who do you consider to be an expert? Or who is an important person in your organization? So what can we say about those who are the nominees of many others? We might be able to say that those are influential people. Similarly, when we're talking about digital data, we can consider the nominator to be the person who initiated or sent an interaction. And the nominee could be the person who was the recipient of the interaction. So if we're talking about discussion forums, for instance, the nominator could be the person who sent a response or a reply to the original poster, who was the recipient of that interaction. So what can we say here? The nominee might be someone whose ideas are taken up by others. And so similarly, might be someone who is influential or important in this case, digital network. So idea number 4 is that relationships can be measured using both self-report and increasingly digital sources of data. For analyzing data, R is really great. It's kind of been developed along with packages for network analysis. And the packages that we recommend using are tidygraph for creating graph objects, kind of structuring our network data in a very particular way, but a way that can help us later on, and ggraph for visualizing networks in a really beautiful way. Also, there's the StatNet collection of packages that you might be familiar with, and if you've learned about or read papers on network analysis, you might be familiar with a particular kind of model, this exponential random graph model, or commonly called an ERGM, which is which you can estimate through a package in this StatNet kind of collection that's really robust and includes a lot of different tools for preparing and modeling network data. So I think 2 more reflection questions, but real quick, what are your goals for analyzing social network data? What might you be interested in doing? So lastly, we'll talk about some technical and ethical considerations for network analysis before summarizing. So in most analyses, preparing data takes a lot of time. If you ask someone who's done a social network analysis before, they might say, creating the visualization was one thing, but just getting the data into the structure I needed it to be in took a while. And this is maybe something that's shared by many analyses, where we spend 80% of our time just cleaning and preparing our data, and then 20% of the time kind of creating the output that we need to answer our question. This is perhaps especially true for network analysis. Regardless of whether the data is self-reported or digital, regardless of how we prepare it, a really useful way to structure data is an edge list, which you can think of as a spreadsheet with 2 columns. One is the nominator, the first, and the second is the nominee. So if, for instance, I said I go to Xian for help, I would be the nominator in saying Xian is someone I go to for help. Xian is an expert in this case. And so this data is repeated row by row for every relationship in our data. So if you have even as few as maybe a dozen people, you might have a couple dozen, 50, 100 rows of data for all of those relationships that you recorded or inferred from your data. So 1 row per social relationship. In most cases, so to that point, these often appear many times in our data. And there can be other columns that are in addition to those 2 core columns that are needed for an edge list, the nominator and the nominee, for other edge-related characteristics. So that could be a variable for how many times a person maybe went to another for help, or how strong their relationship is. or where their interaction took place. So idea 5 is that an edge list is a key structure. If you kind of take away one thing about the format you need your data to be in to do a social network analysis, think edge list, where you have 2 columns with kind of who's initiating the relationship, who's the nominator, and who's kind of the recipient of it, or the nominee. And this structure lets us do things like visualize our data, describe our data using network summary statistics, and model our data later. Lastly, just a few ethical considerations. When we're collecting self-report data, it's often really important to obtain a high response rate, because if we're, for instance, asking a core person about who they go to for help, we might miss a big part of our network, and our inferences might be biased because of that. So to do this, this often requires building a lot of trust with districts and schools in order to collect the data that we need for our network analysis. Privacy can matter a great deal. And so one consequence of this is that our default should be to not include individuals' names in especially network visualizations, but also other products of our analysis. And then finally, just kind of broadly, as we're collecting digital data, this doesn't just apply to network data, but think kind of as IRB guidelines as the baseline, but also ask the question, I think this came up in the first presentation, should I collect this data or should I do this? In other words, is this something that I feel comfortable with? And one way to think about this is not to say we'll never collect any digital data because it might be sort of because of privacy concerns, but rather to think about balancing risk and benefit, even when our IRB says it's okay for us to collect certain data. So is it worth it in terms of what we can learn or how we can improve education from collecting data that might be sensitive to collect? So how might ethical challenges intersect with your social network analysis work? I can think of many ways for mine. Okay, so in summary of the 5 big ideas, if you want to take away one slide from this presentation, this is it. Though we often focus on individuals in our STEM education research, this is the case in my science ed research, we can also focus on relationships between individuals through social network analysis. The kinds of relationships we investigate depend on our research questions, and we have some ways to kind of help us to focus on what those relationships are. Social network analysis is an umbrella. There's not one technique, and it's certainly not just about creating pretty sociograms, although those are great. And what technique you choose depends on the kinds of things that you want to say or the kind of claims you want to make. In other words, what your purpose is with your analysis. So there's not one right kind of social network analysis. Relationships can be measured traditionally using self-reported data, such as by asking teachers who they go to for help or who they turn to when they have a question. And increasingly, relationships can be measured using digital data sources. This is especially relevant to a learning analytics workshop and the Laser Institute. And an edge list is a key data structure. So kind of before you get those beautiful sociograms and your output that you need to answer your research question, you often need to prepare your data in an edge list. This is kind of the 80% of the work that allows you to do that 20% that is so exciting and important. So an edge list is a key data structure. So we'll now head over to